Now come to the motion on the supplementary estimate for the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and the debate on the spending of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. The debate will be led by Sarah Champion, Minister, to move the motion formally. I call, the question is as on the order paper, and I call Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I also thank the Batchbanks Business Committee for selecting this for debate. It is very timely. Can I also thank the members of IDC and FAC for their support in securing this in the name of my friend, the Right Honourable Member from Islington South and Finsbury, and myself. Let me start this debate by welcoming the commitment of the Government to increase our defence spending. It's long overdue and much needed. However, there was no need to announce a decision on where the funding was coming from before the spending review, or indeed before the defence review concluded. It will not surprise this House that I will be using this debate to argue that taking all of the uplift from the Official Development Assistance, ODA, is the wrong decision. The former US Defence Secretary, General James Mattis, was asked in Congress whether it is wise to properly fund international development work. He replied, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition." It pains me to say, but the Prime Minister is setting exactly this dangerous course for the UK. By planning to take 40% out of ODA, he's taking the axe to our most effective tool for reducing global conflicts and for increasing our own national security. Don't take my word for it. Instead, consider this warning, given last week by General Richard Dannett, the former Chief of the General Staff, who wrote, "Every pound we cut from development aid today risks costing us far more in future military operations. Slashing aid further to fund defence spending is not just short-sighted, it is dangerously counterproductive." Lord Dannett added, "We are setting ourselves up for greater instability, which will require even more military spending in the long term. If we cut aid, we will be forced to deploy military resources in areas where we could have mitigated instability through targeted development." I urge the Prime Minister to recognise that, if we abandon our commitments to the world in this way, we will see greater numbers of people displaced from their own homes as a result of climate disasters, poverty and war. More people will lose hope and instead look to extreme ideologies for the answer, and civil societies will no longer have the skills to hold rogue governments to account. It concerns me greatly, as it should the whole House, that the Government has yet to carry out an assessment of the impact of their decisions, which is being rushed through without proper scrutiny. I urge ministers to study carefully an analysis by the One campaign, which demonstrates the real-world impacts of cutting ODA assistance from 0.5 to 0.3 of national income. They have calculated that if the 40% reduction in UK aid is distributed evenly across global health and food programmes, there will be nearly 40 million fewer children immunised. There will be 600,000 fewer lives saved because of reduced support to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB and malaria. And almost 300,000 fewer school children will receive nutritious meals and essential food assistance through the World Food Programme. I appreciate the Prime Minister has pledged to protect what he considers the most vital areas of spending: Gaza, Sudan and Ukraine, vaccinations and climate. But, as the powerful resignation letter written by my Right Honourable friend for Oxford East, the former Development Minister, lays bare, that is sadly a delusion. As my Right Honourable friend, who knows the reality better than anybody else, has written, I quote, "It will be impossible to maintain these priorities given the depth of the cuts. The effect will be far greater than presented. It will likely lead to withdrawal from regional banks and a reduced commitment to the World Bank, the UK being shut out of numerous multilateral bodies, and a reduced voice for the UK in the G7, G20 and in climate negotiations." I will, of course.
I thank my honourable friend, and I thank her especially for her work as chair of the International Development Committee, which I sit on. Earlier today, I had the privilege of meeting representatives from Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, to hear firsthand about their life-saving work. Gavi has, of course, played a pivotal role in ensuring that millions of children worldwide receive vaccines against deadly diseases, protecting global health and preventing future pandemics. Does she agree with me that we need to make an urgent commitment to the Gavi replenishment, which we know is under debate at the moment?
My honourable friend and committee member, and as he is well aware, we're doing a value for money inquiry, and Gavi is one of the best ways to get value for money by vaccinating children around the world. It's not just that this House wants that commitment to Gavi and all other bodies. Do the British public really want us to step away from the international stage, to lose all our soft power and the ability to support the most vulnerable in the world, to lead a healthy and prosperous... I will, because I might get the words straight.
I'll allow you to get your words ready. And I thank my honourable friend for giving way, because she is making the most excellent speech and case for the cut in aid. She knows some of the world's most vulnerable children include disabled children. And the government's disability rights and inclusion strategy was going a long way to supporting these children through healthcare, but also through social protections. Now, does she agree with me that unless we get some clear assurances, many millions of disabled children will end up suffering greater loss? And there are brilliant organisations like Able Child Africa, who are based in my constituency, that are deeply concerned about the impact these cuts are going to have on disabled children.
I thank my honourable friend, and she's absolutely right. The work the FCDO has done to protect the most vulnerable, and I'm particularly thinking of children, people with disabilities, people in marginalised communities, is exemplary. But I cannot stand here and say that we will be able to continue funding that. I just don't think it's technically possible. Research commissioned by the organisation More in Common has found that 55% of the British public support the UK giving humanitarian as well as military aid to Ukraine. More than half believe aid spending is worthwhile if it helps boost the UK economy and protects national security. Minister, even with a reduced aid budget, much better decisions can and must be taken going forwards. Over recent years, a scandalously large amount of ODA has been diverted primarily to the Home Office to support asylum seekers and refugees in the UK. In 2023, this took up 28% of the entire aid budget, costing £4.2 billion. It's welcome that the proportion of ODA budget spent domestically is set to decrease very slightly this year. However, unless these costs are significantly reduced in the next 2 years, the UK is set to spend nearly half of its remaining ODA budget on domestic refugee costs by 2027. This can't be right. Of course these people need supporting, but it shouldn't be coming out of the ODA budget. I urge the government to cap the amount of ODA the Home Office can draw on for in-country refugee costs. Unless this happens, there is simply no incentive for them to address their spending. The Home Office, of course, isn't the only department raiding aid. DEFRA, Education, DSIT all regularly draw down ODA. And in some cases, they are not delivering as well or as transparency as the FCDO can. So can the Minister comment on taking these programmes back into FCDO or asking the departments to reimburse at least part of the finance they are drawing down from ODA? The supplementary estimates saw a boost in FCDO's allocation of headline ODA spending for the current financial year. However, a large proportion of this increase, almost £500 million, was sent to the British International Investment, BII, in a seemingly last-minute panic to ensure the government fulfilled its current commitment to hit 0.5% of national income spent on aid. Don't get me wrong, BII does excellent work, investing in debt and equity into businesses in the developing world. They invest for the long term to facilitate beneficial and developmental economic growth, but they are not set up to take immediate and short-term investment decisions and should not be expected to. There's also been an ongoing debate about giving BII the ability to borrow against their investments, which, in these fiscal circumstances, is something I urge the Minister to look at closely. There are also a number of areas the government could consider changing policy and legislation around. including debt relief, illicit finance and special drawing rights. These actions could have significant impacts on the lives of the poorest in the world, but require no expense from the British taxpayer. Can the Minister also comment on potential multipliers of aid? I'm thinking specifically around philanthropic match funding and aid match, which could be used much more readily. This year's estimates enable FCDO to continue to employ world-leading experts in development aid. In a rapidly changing world, facing huge challenges, maintaining this expertise is not a luxury, it is a necessity for the UK to achieve global process and safeguarding of our collective future. Despite the damage done to its budgets, the FCDO must prioritise protecting its skilled staff who offer so much to low and middle income countries when deployed effectively. My committee and I were with the FCDO staff in Scotland when these cuts were announced last week. Staff were understandably devastated, and this announcement added considerably to the uncertainty they have faced for the last 5 years. The best way to retain our staff, and indeed our international reputation, is with clarity over these forthcoming spending cuts. Can the Minister confirm if there will be a defined step down or if there will be a cliff edge to funding in 2027? A commitment today that the budget will be 0.4% or more in 26-27 would be hugely reassuring, as would confirmation that there will be no additional cuts in the spending review for this financial year. In making tough decisions about what to cut and what to save, can I also urge an equality impact and risk management assessment be done in advance and presented to this House? In 2021 round of cuts, we saw women and girls funding cut by 66% from its peak in 2017. Let us never do that again. From 2023, the UK was the 10th largest spender of aid as a proportion of its GNI. A cut to 0.3 will leave us in 25th place. This is simply unacceptable for a nation with such a proud history in helping those most in need, and a government that is rightly placing itself as a leader on the international stage. I would like to finish with the powerful words of a speech delivered in this chamber on the 13th of July 2021, on the occasion when the Conservative government's decision to reduce aid spending from 0.7 to 0.5 was confirmed. The House was told, cutting aid will increase costs and have a big impact on our economy. Development aid, we all know this, reduces conflict, disease, and people fleeing from their homes. It is a false economy to pretend that this is some sort of cut that does not have consequences. The Speaker continued, our overseas aid budget goes beyond that moral obligation. It also helps build a more stable world and keeps us safer in the UK. This cut will also reduce UK influence just when it is needed most. And of course, it risks leaving a vacuum that other countries, China and Russia, for example, will fill. That Speaker was the then Leader of the Opposition, making an arguable case against the folly of making massive aid cuts. His words are as true now as they were then. Can I urge the Minister, can I urge the Government, listen to the words of the then Leader of the Opposition, the now Prime Minister, and reconsider this?
Colleagues can see how heavily subscribed this debate is, and I need to fit in another debate before 7 o'clock, so many colleagues will be disappointed that they won't be called, so please judge that as you may. We're going to put a speaking limit on so I can get as many people in as possible. The speaking limit is just 4 minutes, and I call Andrew Mitchell next.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the brave and principled speech which the Leader of the Select Committee has just made. Of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Government is absolutely right to increase defence expenditure now, and President Trump is right too in saying that Europe must shoulder the burden against Russian imperial expansion. But development should be part of that very strategy. Development, defence and diplomacy are intertwined, And I remind everyone that what the development budget does is to tackle conflict and help build better societies and build prosperity, to help tackle migration, to tackle disease, medicines, education, vaccinations, growth, jobs. BII, with which I don't entirely agree with the Honourable Lady, but BII is an outstanding example of British success in terms of development. Transparency, accountability, anti-corruption, and of course, all independently verified by the ICAI, the Independent Committee for Aid Impact, which is the taxpayer's friend. That is what development does, and it ought to be unanswerable that this is of vital importance. Now, the cuts from point 7 to point 5 were terrible, but we did manage to find a number of ingenious ways of augmenting that money through guarantees, through co-financing, through insurance, through the use of SDRs. But the reduction to point 3 will destroy any incipient recovery. And as the Honourable Lady said, who is it who will fill the gap in all of this? It will be China and Russia. And of course, it will be music to the ears of the many terrorist organisations which exist across sub-Saharan Africa. And the failure to do some of the things which the Honourable Lady set out so clearly will result in the clarion call of the terrorist being heard. And also, of course, this stopping and starting of development is very bad value for money for taxpayers. Now, I know that Foreign Office ministers will have fought against this terrible decision, and it gives me a chance to pay tribute once again to the Foreign Office and the civil servants and diplomats who work there. It is the finest diplomatic corps in the world. And I also want to pay tribute to the Right Honourable Lady for Oxford East, whose principled resignation letter, Brave, will serve her very well. We all know that this is an example of the iron fist of number 10, conquering the extremely good arguments that will have been put up by the Foreign Office. Cynical, low-hanging fruit, and, in my view, entirely wrong. And many are horrified to see a Labour government, behaving in this way and bludgeoning development already badly damaged by the abolition of DFID and the previous cuts in the last Parliament. I ask colleagues on the opposition benches to make a principled decision about this, to make sure their voices are heard in government, to imagine what those prime ministers who really drove forward international development, the cause of development, turning Britain into a development superpower. Prime Minister Blair, Prime Minister Brown, Prime Minister Cameron, Prime Minister May. These were 4 premiers who drove this cause and did so much good, saving so many lives. And I hope very much that members opposite will exert influence with the government to explain to the government why this is the wrong decision at the wrong time and must be reversed.
Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Since the election of this Labour government last July, I am proud to say that Britain is back on the world stage. And when we're at our best, we are a respected and influential global player. We have many things to our advantage. We are the bridge between the US and Europe. We have a place on the Security Council, and our security services and defence are very respected. Under recent governments, it must be said, we lost our way, fighting amongst ourselves about Brexit and everything else, threatening to break international law. But under this government, we are taking a lead again. So the question is, are we going to step up to this challenge, which we're more than capable of doing, but we can't just do it on 2 chewits, a button and a postage stamp. Alongside a pivot to hard power, the Prime Minister has set out his priorities for the reduced aid budget, Gaza, Sudan and Ukraine. And there is no question that we need that investment in hard power to achieve peace. But if we abandon Britain's soft power strength, we cannot secure it. In Ukraine, for example, political and financial investment in military might are key to the ending of the war in Ukraine. But when we reach the ceasefire, there will be shockwaves across Eastern Europe which must be absorbed. And there are many ways in which Russia will continue on the offensive, and it isn't just about tanks. It's about misinformation, it's about telling lies, it's about trying to influence people by not telling the truth. And the best way to counter that is to tell the truth.
And how are we going to tell the truth? Well, I'll tell you what we could do is we could rely on the BBC World Service, which is internationally respected and recognised. There is nothing like the BBC World Service. We only spend £137 million on it, which is given from the Foreign Office, which is roughly 80% of that comes from ODA. Now, Russia and China combined spend more than £8 billion each year on their services, on their state media. And when we vacate the airways, which we have done, Russia moves in and takes over the same frequencies. If we lose it... yes, I will.
Full to the Honourable Lady, entirely endorse what she says about the BBC World Service. It used to be the case that there was a ring-fenced grant for the BBC monitoring service as well, but that now just falls on BBC general income and expenditure. Does she agree with me that the monitoring service performs an equally crucial role to the World Service in terms of open source information?
Though I think the role has changed given the rise of the internet, but yes. I mean, if we lose it, will this be the moment that we will be remembered, not just as the moment when Britain abandoned Africa to the Chinese, but also at the moment that we abandoned our historic role of telling the truth, of speaking the truth of a united West around the world? The second priority for the aid budget is Gaza. I visited Jordan last week with the Select Committee. Jordan relies on US and UK aid, and it has absorbed over 2 million Palestinian refugees. Its continued stability is fundamental to a lasting peace in the region. Can that be guaranteed if we no longer have the humanitarian budget to spend on it? Third priority from the Prime Minister, Sudan, where we're the pen holder and where we're facing a situation where Russia has secured a Red Sea base that it has long coveted. The situation reminds me of warnings given by Lord Dannatt, the former Chief of the General Staff, that every pound that we spend on development today risks costing us more in future military operation. Soft power isn't just a nice to have. It's actually the core to peace and security. I've looked into the numbers following the latest cuts, and after taking into account the ODA money spent on asylum costs, as well as our commitments to the UN and the like, we only have about £1 billion left to spend on overseas aid by the Foreign Office. Is that really going to be enough, even to take those three priorities and spend the money on that? I am concerned these ODA cuts won't be the last of these challenges. There are also rumours that the Foreign Office will, on top of that, be expecting cuts of between 2 and 11%. In that scenario, it will be selling its businesses, its buildings. Will the embassies shrink? I'm concerned that we'll lose the British Council, which only receives 20% of its funding from the FCDO and generates the rest of its income itself. I trust that there will be an enormous amount of work being done into the details of these cuts, but we haven't heard anything more than aspiration at the moment as to where the other funding is going to come from. Because I fear that we may be looking back at this time and we may say to ourselves, this is when Britain left the world. And yet, it really should be the time when we're able to say, Britain is back, and we're back as a force for good.
Brandreth.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me begin by saying that the decision by the Government to increase defence spending, funded in the short term by a cut in the ODA budget, is the right one given the current global context. This is an immediate solution which was necessary to bolster our defence budget to send a clear message to our allies and our adversaries alike. Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine has brought a state of war back to Europe. But the security challenges we face as a country do not stop with Russia. Iran continues to be a destabilising influence in the Middle East and globally. Meanwhile, China's growing influence demands our attention. The rules-based international order, which the UK proudly defends, is under threat from many sides. A strong foreign policy starts with hard power. That's why I support the Prime Minister's decision to reallocate ODA to the defence budget, and I agreed with the Leader of the Opposition when she called for this in advance of the announcement. It's important that we respond to the challenges of the day with a well-equipped, well-trained, well-supported armed forces. Our adversaries need to know that we have a credible deterrent, and our allies need to be able to look to us as a leader in Europe on defence. It is clear that we are living in a time of mounting geopolitical tension, and without a credible foreign policy strategy, those driving global instability will continue to gain ground. A successful long-term foreign policy strategy must recognise that hard and soft power are inseparable. As has been referred to earlier, it was the retired US General and former Defence Secretary James Mattis who said, if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition ultimately. These are exceptional times. But as stability returns to Europe, I would urge the FCDO to prioritise restoring a strong ODA budget. And it's critical that if the ODA budget is to be spent on defence in the immediate term, that money is spent directly on enhancing our national security and strengthening our armed forces, and not spent on the government's foolhardy decision to cede British sovereignty over the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. A deal which is likely to cost the British taxpayer billions of pounds, all at the expense of our security and strategic interests. Madam Deputy Speaker, with a substantially reduced ODA budget, it is critical that it is spent effectively. It cannot be right that a third of the overseas development assistance budget is spent here in the UK on supporting refugees and asylum seekers. It is clear that we need to rethink where our priorities for the remaining ODA lie. One important area of ODA funding, which the Foreign Affairs Committee have been investigating as part of our inquiry into soft power, is the BBC World Service. With unreliable sources seeking to undermine our values, the World Service is on the front line. So I would encourage the FCDO to continue supporting it, especially as new challenges in information dissemination arise. The consequences of disinformation gaining traction are severe, and we must safeguard this key asset in our soft power arsenal. Madam Deputy Speaker, the lines between hard and soft power are increasingly blurred, yet they must complement each other to be effective. It was necessary to divert funding to meet security challenges. Now the FCDO must rethink how to preserve our soft power, tackle urgent issues like disinformation, and ensure British taxpayers' money spent overseas serves our national interests. Above all, we must use these resources to expand our global influence and enhance our security in the face of evolving challenges.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the clerks of the Foreign Affairs Committee, of which I'm a member, and the International Development Committee for their support, and the Honourable Member for Rotherham for securing this supplementary estimates debate. Late last year, the Foreign Affairs Committee heard evidence from the Foreign Secretary and the now former Permanent Under-Secretary. It was a valuable opportunity for committee members to hear, in the words of Sir Philip Barton, about the tough choices that have been made and will continue to have to be made. Tough choices on our spending, on the aid budget, on investment spending, and on our soft power resources. These tough choices are not new, but in these volatile times, where the power of diplomacy and our soft power matters more than ever, they can have seismic impacts. In 2011, under the coalition government, the BBC World Service had to eliminate 5 language services due to cuts of 46 million per year. This included the entire BBC News service in North Macedonia. Coalition cuts to grants funding from the Foreign Office meant that this trusted service, with extensive reach, one in every 8 Macedonians listened to the BBC, had to be closed. At the time, the country was attempting to join NATO and the EU. Russia was opposed. Since this cut, North Macedonia has been subject to a decade-long propaganda campaign from Russia, a campaign of misinformation which has spread fake news on COVID, amplified regional tensions, and demonised NATO and our European allies. In the past years, the UK has deployed military experts in disinformation to counter malign influence, the malign influence of Russia on the Western Balkans, an influence seeking to destabilise our entire continent. The example of North Macedonia shows that we cannot risk a fractured approach. Cutting the BBC World Service, a trusted news service globally, a news source globally, neglecting our soft power, while our defence spending is countering misinformation, doesn't seem the right thing to do. And the absence of the BBC World Service, as alluded to by our chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, allows our adversaries to step in and fill the vacuum left by the UK's withdrawal. And there are real dangers when we allow hostile propaganda to go unchallenged. It's been described as a tsunami of bad actors. And while Conservative cuts forced the BBC World Service in the Middle East, BBC Arabic, to cease broadcasting, the same frequency was taken over by Russia Today and Sputnik. The global director of BBC News told the Foreign Affairs Committee that on the day of the walkie-talkie explosions in Lebanon, that the frequency was essentially Russian propaganda. Russia is investing in disinformation, to target Arabic-speaking audiences and to create false pretexts for its invasion of Ukraine. Madam Deputy Speaker, disinformation has real-world consequences. Yeah. And where the UK soft power retreats, hostile states step in. They are pumping billions of pounds because they know what's at stake, the battle for the truth. Future assessments of funding for the World Service must consider the impact on the international and national security of disinformation on our world. This is just one example which demonstrates that our national defence and our spending overseas are both vital for this nation's long-term security. I've been pleased to see that this government's commitment to BBC World Service grant funding reflected in the FCDO supplementary estimate. We know there are tough choices to be made, and we know that there are those wishing to do harm to Britain, and we know that the defence of our country in an ever more dangerous world is essential, and we must put Britain's defences and Britain first. But despite this, I've been pleased to see that the government reiterated its firm commitment to prioritise programmes in Ukraine, Sudan and Gaza. There are clearly many strategic calculations to be taken into account. But the impartial and trusted journalism of the BBC World Service is an antidote to disinformation. The risks from malign actors who want to undermine democracy are not going away anytime soon. I would strongly urge ministers to ensure that assessments of funding for the World Service take into account the national security consequences of disinformation.
Order. Edward Morello.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office plays a vital role in supporting and protecting people around the world, upholding Britain's diplomatic presence and promoting our values and interests. In my short time on the Foreign Affairs Committee, I have been repeatedly struck by the impressive quality of the people we are fortunate enough to have working for us on our behalf around the world. Yeah. However, even as we face increasing geopolitical instability, transactional diplomacy and wars in multiple regions, the financial pressure on the department is testing our ability to play the role Britain should be playing in the world. For over a decade, the maintenance of the FCDO overseas estate, which includes 6,000 properties across 180 countries, has been funded through the sale of assets. This is not a sustainable model, and the reality is that there is no more silverware left to sell. Giving evidence to the Foreign Affairs Committee, Sir Philip Barton, the then outgoing Permanent Undersecretary, acknowledged that the current funding structure will not work for much longer. The cost of essential maintenance is estimated to be £250 million a year, and that figure is only rising. From next year, the ability to draw down from receipts of previous asset sales will disappear completely. Unless the Treasury allows for this additional cost in future budgets, the cost will have to be met by cuts elsewhere in an already overstretched department. This issue goes beyond just bricks and mortar. The UK's overseas presence is a direct reflection of our diplomatic standing and soft power. We cannot expect our embassies to champion British interests when they are in dire need of investment. The Foreign Secretary himself has recognised the need for a sustainable funding saddle and highlighted the condition of our estate in China as a particular concern. The government must set out an alternative long-term funding model, one that does not rely on a fire sale of national assets. At the same time, we must address the deeply concerning cuts to ODA. The UK has long been a world leader in international aid. We are the fourth highest donor in absolute terms. And the government's decision to reduce our aid budget risks undermining our ability to deliver on those commitments and the ones we've made to the world's most vulnerable. The Prime Minister has rightly stated that the UK will prioritise Ukraine, Sudan, Gaza, climate finance and global health, but with a shrinking budget, delivering on these priorities will be close to impossible. I recognise that difficult choices must be made in order to stand firmly with our allies in Ukraine during this critical time. Our support for the Ukrainian people must be strong and unwavering. It is a sad indictment of the current state of global affairs that in a war between the West and Russia, the first to withdraw from the fight was the United States. It is therefore even more vital that we increase defence spending to ensure that our allies around the world know that they can continue to rely on Britain in this increasingly unstable world. But the answer is not to cut ODA. The Foreign Secretary himself warned on the risks of stepping back from development aid. The reality is that cuts in budget will severely limit our ability to counter malign influences and support fragile states. My party has warned the UK's decision to reduce its own aid spending will leave a vacuum for Russia and China to fill. I urge the government to look at liberal... Of course I will, yes.
I thank him for giving way. I just thought it was worth reflecting on the fact that UK Army Service personnel, obviously key to the defence of our country, Those cuts actually started during the time when the Liberal Democrats were in opposition, and he talked there about his party regretting the actions of this government. Can I ask whether he regrets the decision to start cutting our service personnel from 2010 onwards?
Edward Morello.
I'm not going to waste time re-arguing the coalition years. We've got a crisis happening globally. Either we all work together on this or we keep nitpicking over the past. That's not the way to go forward. I urge the government to look at the Liberal Democrat proposals to fund much-needed uplift in defence spending, not by cutting vital overseas development aid, but by reversing the tax cuts of the previous government for banks and by taxing the social media companies that even now are profiting from spreading the disinformation on behalf of our enemies. We must work together to secure a sustainable funding model for the FCDO, one that protects the overseas estates and ensures that our diplomats have the resources they need to represent Britain effectively. Finding a pathway to a just peace in Ukraine, a workable solution for Palestinian and Israeli people, security for Europe, a united global approach to tackling the climate crisis, and the many other issues that we face in the world right now, and in the face of a US administration seemingly intent on joining malign states like Russia and Iran in rejecting the international norms, this requires the UK to be centre stage in international relations. Having a Foreign Office able to project British influence has never been more important. I urge the government to set out a clear path on how we will maintain our diplomatic and development commitments in this increasingly uncertain world and ensure that Britain does not become just some random country, but continues to play its historic role in global affairs.
Taylor.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I want to start, as many members of this House has, by recognising the urgent need to increase defence spending. I, over recess, went to Ukraine for a week. It is an existential crisis. If Ukraine falls, I am convinced that the Baltic states will be in Putin's line of sight too. But like others in this House, I am obviously extremely pained by the decision to partly get there by cutting aid down to 0.3%. People in this House will know that prior to coming to this House, I spent my career in international development. I set up something called the Labour Campaign for International Development and had the privilege of working for former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who did such great things when he was Prime Minister and Chancellor to lead on the world stage on this area. But I want to offer my expertise to the government to try and find a way through this. And I want to recognise that across the House, and particularly on our benches, there are other people like myself who do have expertise in development, and we offer ourselves forward to the government to try and find ways in which we can ensure we can make the best of this bad situation. The first point that I want to make is about front-loading multilateral commitments into 2026, because we know that the ODA budget is going to go down from 2027 to 0.3% of GNI. We believe by front-loading some of the multilateral commitments into the Global Fund and so on, we can ensure that we get round this issue of a cliff edge and ensure that we're helping the most number of people for the largest number of time. You know, I know that there are some discussions already about potentially it going down in 2026, and I just urge the government to look at other options to ensure that we can keep aid spending at 0.5% for as long as possible. The second point is I want to refer to the comments that the Honourable Member of Rotherham made about asylum costs. We really do urge the government to look strongly at that and to ensure that we reduce as quickly as possible the amount of money that is being spent in the UK. Every penny that's spent in the UK is not being spent helping the most vulnerable. And to deliver this, the government could formally budget for and commit to project reductions in donor refugee costs, with any overspends of these levels funded from outside the aid budget and any underspends provided to the FCDO as additional ODA resources. The second point I won't talk about for long, because I know that the Honourable Member for Kensington and Bayswater has done a lot of advocacy on this, but that's around the Chelsea money. Like, it's £2.5 billion. The sooner we can get that into Ukrainian humanitarian aid, the better, because that should, in theory, free up ODA money to go to other situations around the world. The final point I want to make is that we have to really now focus some time and effort into alternative forms of ODA spending. And I know that my honourable friend for Birmingham Hodge Hill, in particular in his role as the chair of the MP group on the World Bank, has some fantastic ideas about how we might be able to draw upon things such as special drawing rights. And I know that there are other colleagues that are working on things like debt relief that, again, could offer alternative sorts of development financing.
On that point,
I will give way.
On alternatives, do we not think it's sometimes a little false dichotomy separating our defence and ODA? For instance, human security approach, where there's crises like conflict or famine or pandemics, we can utilise our forces with a human security approach to come in and deliver that, as well as utilising traditional ODA.
My honourable member makes an interesting point, and I hope he'll get to make it in greater detail in due course, because in the time allowed to me, I do want to just carry on with a few other suggestions that we have. Another regards the British international investments. Now, I'm not here to criticise the work that they are doing, but the point of ODA, first and foremost, is to help the people in extreme poverty first. And there has been a track record over the years that admittedly has improved, where BII has not necessarily focused on the very poorest in society. And for that reason, I do think the government should look at ways in which we could make capitalisations of BII additional to the 0.3%. Now, the justification for this could be that, I won't, if you don't mind, could be that the BII makes capital investments which are ultimately an asset on the government's balance sheet, and this finance does not count towards the government's budget deficit. And therefore, I think that could be one way we could ensure justification without going against the government's fiscal rules. I've only got 30 seconds left, so I will just end where I started. Other people in this House have made points about how aid is in our national interest, and they are right to do so. For me, this has also always been ultimately about how we can benefit another human being, because where we are born is an accident. I am privileged to live in what I consider to be the best country in the world, but many aren't, and everything we can do to support the most vulnerable must be done.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. That a Labour government, after all it said during the years it was in opposition, has decided to take away essential life-saving overseas aid from the poorest people on the planet is truly astonishing and utterly shameful. Because they know that removing £6 to £7 billion of overseas aid will have devastating consequences. It will mean that the world's poorest children will go unvaccinated. It will mean that millions of girls will go uneducated. And projects set up to help communities recover and protect themselves from climate change will come to an end. And there's no running away from the fact that millions of people, mainly children, will die or have their lives permanently changed as a result of this decision. And neither can they escape from the fact that this was a premeditated political decision taken by a Labour Prime Minister. That Prime Minister has tried shamefully to frame this debate as an either-or, that we either spend the money on defence or we spend it on overseas aid, and it is palpably not true. Indeed, it would be laughably disingenuous were it not so serious. If, and I agree that we are heading into uncharted waters in terms of European security and defence, then the government needs to rip up its self-imposed fiscal rules and have an honest conversation with the public about what must be done. Explain to the public that with an emboldened Putin and with America no longer a trustworthy or reliable ally, that we in Europe have to look after and fend for ourselves, and that is going to mean tough choices. This is morally reprehensible. Cutting overseas aid, they know, will make us less secure. And as the Honourable Member for Rotherham said, if they need convincing, read the Prime Minister's speech from July the 13th in 2021. He lays it out line by line. It is an excellent speech. You should read it. I just wish he had meant it. Madam Deputy Speaker, absolutely no one believes that we can make ourselves safer and more secure by making the world's poorest even poorer. When he announced this decision to increase defence spending by cutting overseas aid, the Prime Minister attempted to justify it, saying that it could only be funded through hard choices and that this for him was a painful and difficult decision. Well, it's not nearly as painful or as difficult as it's going to be for millions of impoverished children who don't know where their next meal is coming from, or for girls not knowing when the next time they're going to be able to go to school, or wondering why their siblings are dying of preventable diseases because they haven't been vaccinated, or wondering where their father has gone when they've gone to Europe to try and find work. So, Prime Minister, save me your crocodile tears about this being a difficult decision. This was not a difficult decision. This was an easy option.
Qureshi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to begin by declaring that I am the chair of the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, an organisation that has done incredible work around the world and is partially funded by the FCDO. The Foreign Secretary was absolutely right last week when he said that realism includes being clear what our values are. The reality is that alongside the military security gap left by the US administration's approach, we must also fill the gap in support for accountability, inclusion and the rule of law. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is about UK security and prosperity. Our ODA budget supports stability and alliances critical to our national interests. Yes, we are losing the battle for hearts and minds in many parts of the world, whilst our rivals help friendly rulers silence opposition, control the media and outlaw NGOs. If we do not step up, others will fill the vacuum. WFD is part of the answer. It operates in 50 countries, strengthening democracy and the rule of law. Its FCDO grant this year was about 8.5 million. With additional country-specific grants, we maximise impact globally, but funding cuts are already hitting us. The WFD spending review bid for flat cash of 8.5 million in 26 to 27 would fund programming in 20 countries and 14 global initiatives on AI in Parliament, public debt, climate, electoral integrity and women's political leadership. Its reach is significant in that 5,000 plus participants, half of them women, with engagement from over 1,600 parliamentarians, 2,400 parliamentary staff and 1,700 political party officials. This work delivers results: anti-corruption reform, improved rule of law, climate legislation scrutiny, and the strongest UK relationship with democratic leaders. But inflation could leave a funding gap of over 500,000, equivalent to 70% of the WFD's work in the Indo-Pacific. We cannot afford to let this happen. Madam Deputy Speaker, investing in democracy is investing in the UK's security, prosperity and global influence, with so many bad faith actors now in the world, and with a constant onslaught on democracies across the world. It is so important that the work the Westminster Foundation for Democracy does is vital and should be protected.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I share the horror, the outrage, the deep, deep disappointment and disillusionment of so many in this House, across so many parties, and indeed across the country, at this terribly short-sighted, counterproductive decision by the government to fund greater investment in defence through slashing the development budget. Now, I know, like many here, how important the development budget is, because I spent practically my entire career before I came to this place working in that field, like so many on these benches. I've seen it face to face. I've seen it on the ground. I know that investing in health, in education, in nutrition helps increase human security for the long term. I know that investing in conflict resolution, peace building, democracy support, women and girls' rights, those things build human security globally and make the world and us more secure in the long term and indeed in the short and medium term. So that is why it's so impossible to understand why the government has taken this incredibly counterproductive decision. The 3 Ds of defence, diplomacy and development are united. They work together. You cannot possibly increase one by slashing another. It's unbelievable that this decision has been made because it is so unnecessary. Yeah. Now, a member on the opposite benches talked earlier about needing to, what was the wording used? Needing to send a clear message. What is the message that has been sent by this decision that follows in the slipstream of President Trump's blocking, dismantling of USAID? It is the wrong message. Members on the other benches, indeed the Prime Minister himself, have talked about tough choices. It's a wrong choice because there is an alternative. We didn't have to fund this investment on the backs of the poorest and most marginalised. There are other choices available to us. We should ask those with the broadest shoulders to bear the burden of increased investment in defence and security. Indeed, our neighbours in France are doing exactly that, looking at wealth taxes. So why is it, I hope the Minister will explain in his summing up, why is it that the government has decided to fund investment in defence by undermining diplomacy and development, by slashing the aid budget, leaving us all more insecure in the long run? Thank you.
Mohamed. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, we've seen and heard from many FCDO representatives on the important work that the department does and how essential the resources are for them to be able to execute their work effectively. Madam Deputy Speaker, the world is witnessing a watershed moment unfolding before our very own eyes. The world order is visibly in the process of being challenged and transforming in all aspects of organised human life. And this provides an immensely challenging environment for foreign policy, from wars in Sudan, Gaza and Ukraine to concerns about climate change. Last week, the Prime Minister demonstrated strong leadership and reinforced that we do have a strong presence in the global arena, and it highlighted that we must continue to remain actively engaged and agile in our foreign policy. The Prime Minister's commitment to increase defence spending in light of the volatility is the right one. But whilst I recognise that defence spending is important, so too is international development, particularly in relation to the diplomatic soft powers that it lends the UK. As we navigate this change in an unpredictable global power dynamics, international development is an area of our historical strength. UK aid makes the world safer and it saves lives. Cutting support for countries who need it the most will only add to insecurity worldwide. Voices outside of the aid sector, and colleagues referenced this earlier on, Lord Richard Dannett, a former head of the British Army, has said, cutting aid risks making us weaker, not stronger. Well-targeted aid prevents conflict and reduces the burden on our armed forces in the long run. Analysis from the One campaign supports this. Their evidence demonstrates that for every 80 pence spent on activities that spur economic growth and political stability, this can avert spending of up to £80 on future conflicts. Madam Deputy Speaker, cutting the aid budget will undercut our ability to build global partnerships and alliances. When the UK helps countries to adjust to climate change, to grow and to prosper, we build our relationships and our influence. When countries like ours withdraw, China and Russia stand ready to step in. Madam Deputy Speaker, if I may, I'd now like to come on to the impact that these cuts will have on a specific group, women and girls across the world. As we celebrate International Women's Day later this week, it is critical that we stand up for protecting gender equality with the UK's ODA budget. This includes improving access to education, maternal health care, malnutrition, preventing response to gender-based violence and combating early marriage and FGM. When ODA is reduced, we know that women's equality programmes are the first to be cut. Yeah. When the cut was implemented in 2021, 41% of women and girls initiatives were the first to be lost. When governments take action to close gaps and eliminate barriers for women and girls to realise their rights, to live safely and to learn and earn equally, we then create safer, healthier and wealthier societies. Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK's leadership in international development has long been a source of national pride and global respect, and we should not now head in the opposite direction. If we are seeing the decline of aid to support the world's most vulnerable communities, then the government could show serious ambition to reform the global economy, and this could include tackling the broken global debt system to enable those countries most in need to emerge from poverty. And this could be achieved by fixing global debt for developing countries by compelling private lenders operating in the City of London to cooperate in debt relief negotiations. Sir John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it's a particular pleasure to follow the Chair and indeed 4 fellow members of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Let me start by making clear that I strongly support the increase in defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. Indeed, I fear that may not be enough, and we will have to spend more if we are to maintain our security against the threat, which is now clear. I therefore accept that part of the funding of that needs to come from ODA, although I feel the pain both of the Chair of the International Development Committee and my right friend for Sutton Coldfield. And I have to say that it makes it even harder to swallow the £9 billion bill which we are facing to pay for the maintaining a base on the Chagos Islands. But I do want to focus specifically on soft power. I welcome the establishment within the FCDO of the Soft Power Council, and it is very important that strengthening hard power should not be at the expense of Britain's soft power. A number of members have already talked about the BBC World Service. It is one of our great assets, and it was very welcome that the government in the budget increased the government's contribution by £32 million. But it was concerning that the BBC have recently announced a reduction in their contribution of £6 million with the loss of 130 jobs. And while all 42 language services are being maintained, the World Service Defence Committee has already pointed out the damage that some of those reductions are going to do with the loss of regional editors, with science coverage, with business programmes. And I'm particularly concerned about the letter that the chair of our committee received a few days ago from the Director General, in which he says, I quote, "In the last few days we have been asked to prepare for further engagement with the FCDO on the impact of a reduction in overseas development spending." And I would like the Minister to assure us that there will be no reduction in the Foreign Office's funding of the BBC World Service. And indeed, I hope he will give serious consideration to the BBC's request that the government should consider in the longer term taking on the full funding of the World Service. We have also heard in the committee from the British Council another aspect of soft power where it is absurd that the loan given to them of £250 million has to be renewed each year, creating huge uncertainty looking forward. And I would hope that a solution can be found to put that onto the long-term basis. But I want to finish by just referring to a particular issue that is of huge concern to me and many others, and that is media freedom. The government has a very good record, both this government and the previous, for supporting media freedom around the world. We set up the Global Media Coalition, but the Minister will know that media freedom is under huge threat. I urge the government to continue to press the case of Jimmy Lai, a British citizen imprisoned in Hong Kong, and of Alaa Abdel Fattah, a British citizen imprisoned in Egypt. But he will know that in Ukraine, 97 journalists have been killed since 24th of February 2022, 12 whilst on duty. And the most recent withdrawal of funding by USAID is going to put at risk over half of the media outlets that are bravely reporting what is happening to people in Ukraine. And I hope the Minister can provide support to them too.
Blair McDougall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's appropriate we have such a distinguished internationalist in the chair for this debate. This isn't giving me any extra time. Can I say I recognise the impossible decisions that the government has to make, but I just hope we don't make the false dichotomy of believing that the moral preferences that we have to be at odds with our strategic interests. But I do recognise that the government are making budgetary decisions in response to real-world events that are happening very painfully every day. I represent many of the workers in DFID from East Kilbride. I myself worked for 10 years delivering aid. So I don't want to relitigate what others have said in pleading for the international development budget, but I do want to specifically ask and to perhaps challenge the government on one thing, which is what is now, if we are not, as the Right Honourable Member for Sutton Coldfield said, still the development superpower, what is our offer to the global south? We know what Russia's offer is. It's blood for gold. They will come, they will kill your enemies with mercenaries for you and take precious minerals out of your country. We know what it is for China. It is infrastructure in return for debt that keeps you in their power. We cannot offer violence. We can't demand subservience. It seems to me for us it's values. But values need vehicles to be projected through. And I want to mention two of those in particular in the time that I've got. I want to add my voices to the voices of other members and right honourable members in defence of the BBC. Others have spoken about how development helps save money in defence. It's also the other way around. When defence fails, development picks up the pieces. If we need one example of that, Madam Deputy Speaker, we can look to Afghanistan. That when we left Afghanistan, we left behind the BBC World Service as the only broadcast journalism which is now in country there. It's the only thing which is still there, saying to those people, we have not abandoned you. And the cuts imply very deep cuts to the World Service, which I hope we now will not see. But the second thing I wanted to plead for is that as we're standing here today, the democratic infrastructure which supports dissidents, Democrats around the world, the people I worked with, is being dismantled because of Elon Musk's vandalism. People who are the most extraordinarily brave people that I've ever met are being utterly abandoned. And I know that I will give way. Yes.
Do you know, I want to congratulate the member for his contribution. He and I will disagree on a lot, but not on this. Will he pay tribute to those who work with the Conflict Stabilisation Fund, which is a particularly important area of work in all the areas that he's just rightly touched upon?
I'm very, very happy to do so. And the honourable gentleman and I have worked closely together on Georgia. There we have a country where, for the cost of a single Storm Shadow missile over recent years, we are on, I think, day 96 of huge street protests in the backyard of Vladimir Putin. And so I know we can't fill all of the gaps, but I hope we can triage and try and look at places like Ukraine, like Georgia, like Moldova, like Belarus, where a small amount of money makes an enormous amount of strategic difference. And if investing in arms allows us to fight, we've also got to remember that we have to invest in the reasons why we want to fight in the first place. The fundamental weakness of the authoritarians, who we are now in this unspoken war with, is the same. Every act of brutality from them is a confession of their weakness. They know that if their people were free to choose, that they would not choose the form of government that's there. We know that all that they offer is corruption, violence and brutality against their own people. They will choose in that global fight to be on our side, but we do need to put the resources in to make that case every single day around the world with confidence.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I, like everyone in this House, stands in full solidarity with Ukraine and also recognise the threat posed by hostile actors like Putin and agree that the UK defence spending must increase to enhance our national security. However, this decision to raid the development budget does not increase security. It does the very opposite. Decreasing overseas development assistance is utter folly, and it fundamentally undermines efforts to bring about justice, peace and security in the world. The Prime Minister knows this. He stood in this chamber and criticised Boris Johnson and the previous Conservative government when they made their first cuts and made these very points. He was elected on a manifesto pledging rebuild Britain's reputation in international development with a new approach based on genuine respect and partnership. We all agree on that. However, instead, in a fashion that has become typical of his leadership, he's U-turned on his promise and made cuts even further than the Conservatives previously were willing to go. Madam Deputy Speaker, put simply, this decision by the Prime Minister is a death sentence for hundreds of thousands of people, and it will have a devastating impact on millions of the world's most vulnerable and marginalised. Children will go hungry and will miss out on life-saving vaccinations. They will die as a result. Girls will lose access to education, family planning and reproductive health clinics. As a consequence, they'll be forced into early marriage and have an increased risk of being victims of gender-based violence. Refugees will lose access to accommodation and vital support services and will be displaced once again. Not only has the Prime Minister reneged on his promises and the UK Government abandoned its moral duty, it has done so without any impact assessment whatsoever. It has done so with a callous disregard of the lives of others throughout this world. Madam Deputy Speaker, it does not have to be like this. In 2023, Germany, our G7 European ally, spent 0.82% of GNI in ODA, while others such as the Netherlands, Ireland, Denmark, Sweden and Norway spent greater percentages than the UK. We are all facing the same threats, so why is the UK the only one is cutting back? And I'm looking forward to hear how the Minister responds to that. The Prime Minister has once again sought to appease President Trump, to follow the lead of reform and short-sighted right-wing voices who believe that those in the rest of the world simply don't matter and that our actions abroad have no impact at home. It's wrong. The UK's role in the world is built on hard power, soft power and diplomacy. As a former member of the International Development Committee, I've travelled around the world and I've heard the devastating impacts since the UK's first cut in ODA in 2020. I've heard how the trust in the UK has been eroded, and I've heard directly from leaders of countries who are increasingly turning to others, such as China and Russia, to fill the void in the UK's absence. The threats that we face are interconnected and they disregard international borders. We have faced a global pandemic and we will encounter more. We are in the midst of a climate emergency and it's not going away. We are experiencing war in Europe and a challenge to the rules-based system. These should be our catalyst to increase our aid and development and to solve these problems collectively. Yet, tragically, this Labour government are following in the footsteps of Conservative government who use COVID as an excuse to cut by using defence spending as their excuse to step away when they should be stepping up. Madam Deputy Speaker, this madness must stop. All of us in this House must come together and find another route that's in our national interest to finance defence spending. This simply cannot come to pass without a fight.
Alice MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank my Select Committee for securing this debate. 20 years ago, the words of Nelson Mandela rang out just down the road in Trafalgar Square. He called on the world to make poverty history, stating that as long as poverty, injustice and gross inequality persist, none of us can truly rest. And I hope we remember these words as we continue in this conversation. I do, of course, welcome the uplift in the defence spending, but as someone who has campaigned and worked in international development for years, this decision is very painful, as the Prime Minister himself has acknowledged. When I think of why our aid matters, I think of the women I met in Dadaab refugee camp who had finally got some safety after years of uncertainty. I think of the children being vaccinated against life-threatening diseases. I think of the response to the Ebola crisis, which not only saved lives in the countries affected, but protected us all. And I think of our development work not only as life-saving, but as a form of international insurance for all of us. UK aid is around 1p in every pound of public spending, and it brings a huge return on investment, as we have heard before. It is a down payment to prevent the spread of disease, conflict, tackle the upstream drivers of migration and increase prosperity. And I say that because many of my constituents have wrote to me and urged me to come and speak today, but I think we get far less emails from people about aid than we do about other things. And as we continue in this conversation about some of the real difficult choices that have to be made and other forms of financing, we have to continue to make the case for aid, both in its own right, but also for our own interests. But as many, and I don't want to repeat all of the points, but I think we have to focus now on a few key things. The timeline is key, as the Chair of the Select Committee has underlined, and I hope the Minister will respond to that. Can we expect 0.5 next year and the year after before we get to 0.7? Because that could be billions of pounds and millions of lives. We have to make sure that when we're making those decisions, and I wouldn't like to be in the Minister's shoes because these are frankly difficult, if not impossible decisions, that the House is updated on what criteria is being used. Is it bilateral versus multilateral? Is it this country over another? Is it this programme or this programme? And as my friend for Hemel Hempstead has underlined, there is expertise, and we hope to work with you constructively on that. The UK legislation already sets out what we need to consider, that our aid is likely to contribute to a reduction in poverty, and it also says consider providing it in a way that contributes to gender inequality, as my friend for Sheffield has mentioned. And that focus on women and girls is vital. I back the calls from many NGOs, including CARE and UNICEF, to make sure that a new commitment to target at least 20% of bilateral ODA on gender equality, and I hope the Minister can respond directly to that call in his comments. I echo the points on getting down the amount of money that is spent in this country on refugee costs. It is unacceptable that it's 28% of the budget most recently. I know our government is committed to bringing down that spend and tackling the backlog, but the sooner we can do that, and with a clear commitment that that money will go back to the aid budget, is really vital for many of us. I hope you could update on the conversations with the Home Office on this. And this is really a whole-of-government approach. It's Treasury, it's Home Office, it's development. We have to make sure that it is a conversation across the whole House. We must also leverage other forms of financing. And for time, I would just mention debt. We have done a lot on this before as a Labour government. I hope we will do so again, because 32 African countries are spending more on their external debts than they are able to spend on healthcare and education, which is frankly a scandal. I also hope we could do more remittances. We know how much is sent back from diaspora communities here overseas, but the cost is still far too high, and that would not be a cost for this government. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, these are indeed challenging times. I appreciate these are tough choices, but we also have to keep a clear commitment to getting back to 0.7 as soon as circumstances allow. We are an internationalist party. We believe in the power of aid, and we will continue fighting to remain that is the case.
Johnny Reid. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. East Kilbride, part of my constituency, has a very long and proud history as a key part of the UK's international development efforts. Generations of dedicated civil servants have worked there to tackle global poverty, to strengthen partnership and uphold Britain's reputation as a force for good in the world. However, today I rise to express my deep concern that this government is on the verge of severing that proud connection. The proposed closure of the Overseas Development Office in East Kilbride is a mistake, not just for my constituents, but for the integrity of Britain's global development work. Yeah. Let me be clear, East Kilbride is not a suburb of Glasgow. It is a town in its own right, designated as part of the New Town movement by the no, I won't for time reasons, sorry, by the post-war Labour government. It's Scotland's second largest town, with its own economy, its own identity.
Excuse me, order. Andrew, is it really a point of order?
Yes, it is a point of order. As far as I'm aware, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is not true that the office in East Kilbride is being closed. It's being moved to Glasgow, and as I'm advised, there are no plans by the government to change that arrangement.
Point of order is noted by the Chair. I don't think that is a matter for the Chair. Time is limited. I'll go back to Jenny Reid.
Thank you. As I said, East Kilbride is not Glasgow, and to close the Development Office and shift these jobs to Glasgow is not just administering, tinkering with the administration. It's a blow to our community that has built itself around the development opportunities that this office provides. It's taking well-paid, good skilled jobs from a town and centralising them in a city, the very kind of decision that too often leaves towns left behind. And I know that many of my right honourable friends share those concerns about hollowing out towns like East Kilbride, and I urge them to think again. This decision is also being made at a moment of deep uncertainty for the civil servants in international development. The government has already made this very difficult, very painful decision. It's not a decision that I celebrate, but it's a decision that I support, because governing means taking tough choices, not the easy ones. But closing this office and moving to Glasgow at a time when there is such deep uncertainty about the international development budget and no clear evidence that it will do anything other than cost money in the immediate term is ill-advised. Labour has a proud legacy built on pioneers like our local Judith Hart, and we must not allow that legacy to be weakened by short-term thinking. We're in an era now of words are not enough, of show and not tell, and if we really believe in the role that East Kilbride can play, and we should continue to play in shaping Britain's international engagement, then the answer is clear. Take this closure off the table and use that money to focus on the announced priorities in international development.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to start by saying that I support the government's increase in defence spending from 2.3 to 2.5%, and actually would like to see the government go further and for it to rise to 3% as soon as possible. But I should say that there is an urgency to increase defence spending, and it would have been wrong to wait until the spring spending review later this year. Yet the reduction of development assistance, I feel, is the wrong place to look for the money, because it's not only devastating for humanitarian projects or development assistance, it has significant geopolitical consequences. For years, Britain has led in providing development assistance to countries in desperate need, helping them to develop, while also strengthening our global influence. But now, with both the US and UK cutting back on aid, we risk creating a vacuum that will be filled by authoritarian actors. Countries that were previously aligned with the West or were hedging will have little choice but, as they see it, to shift fully towards countries hostile to the UK. This isn't speculation. I make this observation based on historical precedents. In 2021, France suspended €10 million in aid and halted military cooperation with the government of the Central African Republic. The Central African Republic sought alternative partners, including for security, and went to Russia's Wagner Group. And then Wagner deployed mercenaries to support government forces in their fight against rebels, solidifying their and Russia's role in the Central African Republic, but also then securing economic resources, securing the mineral resources such as gold and diamonds from the Central African Republic. And when Russia expanded its foothold in Africa, it gained both economic leverage but also political influence. And this political shift was apparent in the Central African Republic's voting record at the United Nations. Historically, the Central African Republic aligned with the West, supported key resolutions such as the continuation of the UN observation mission in Georgia. But more recently, what we've seen is on critical UN votes in the General Assembly, for example, on Ukraine, the Central African Republic has either abstained or voted against resolutions condemning Russia. We see this elsewhere too. We've seen it, for example, with China's Belt and Road Initiative. It's well known that China deepened its ties with both Tanzania and Zambia, investing in roads, ports, energy projects, and meanwhile Western influence in those countries waned, with China emerging as their primary partner. And what we've seen is senior Zambian government officials, including ministers and permanent secretaries, participating in training programs in Beijing every year, focusing on governance, thus pushing China's authoritarian ideology and influence across Zambia. Historically, when the West withdraws, China and Russia step in. That's exactly what will happen with cuts to the FCDO budget, specifically the cutting of development aid to 0.3% of GDP. To conclude, let's not erode democratic values across the globe or weaken our ability to advocate for a fairer and a more democratic world, because it is also in British interests. Thank you.
We're going to drop the time limit down to 3 minutes. Cat Eccles.
Speaker. In the uncertain global situation we're currently living in, I welcome the announcement of increased defence spending, and I'm sure that will also be welcomed by 6-3 Military Intelligence Company in my constituency of Stourbridge. They're based at the Army Reserve Centre with minimal permanent staff and more than 90 reservists from across the Black Country and beyond. It was great to see a female officer leading the Remembrance Day parade this year, a celebration of their diversity and strength. But as part of the increased defence spend, we must harness the power and skill of British business. Last week, I visited Welland Lammy, the UK's leading designer, manufacturer and service provider of davits, winches and lifting appliances for the global marine and offshore industry. Founded in 1901, the business found a home in Brierley Hill in 1989 and proudly employ over 40 local people and train multiple apprentices each year. I was impressed to hear that they source nearly all of their materials within a 5-mile radius, and they are the leading supplier to the US Navy and US Coast Guard. They are keen to break into the UK defence market, but under the previous government, Welwyn Lambie bid for Ministry of Defence contracts, but narrowly lost out to a Spanish firm. I also welcome the government's continued support to Ukraine. Last year, I had the opportunity to visit, and some of the things I saw and heard will never leave me. We visited a children's hospital in Kyiv, which had been bombed by Russia just a few weeks before, showing that Russia isn't even following the rules of war by targeting civic infrastructure. I met the strongest and most resilient people who are steadfast in their continued fight against Russian aggression. Ukrainian MPs who are battling against Russian propaganda and misinformation in a new frontier of digital combat. Ordinary people helping one another rebuild their homes and villages, and doctors and nurses treating and rehabilitating the ever-growing number of casualties. On a visit with the Mayor in Chernihiv, it was clear that funding to Ukraine is not always reaching the people who need it most, ordinary, hard-working Ukrainians. And I would urge FCDO ministers to ensure that funds sent to Ukraine are fairly distributed across the country to the communities that need them most. It was disappointing to hear that the increased funding will come at the expense of the ODA, and I'm still not convinced it's the right thing to do. I understand security at home is of vital importance, but should we, as the Labour Party, really be cutting support to some of the world's most vulnerable people? There is crucial work happening in developing countries in health, education and climate change, and abandoning that work leaves a void for Russia and China to fill. What does that leave for our support to Gaza, Sudan and beyond at a time when the US is pulling its aid? Investing in international development is an important contribution to security, both at home and abroad.
Brian Matthew.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I believe the UK's international development spending must be used effectively, with a primary focus on poverty reduction, and we must reverse the ODA cut and get back to 0.7% GNI, probably our proudest achievement under the coalition government as Liberal Democrats. Putting the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals at the heart of our international development policy, including access to clean water, sanitation, health and education, and achieving food security. But for now, we are where we are. And with our total aid budget now likely to be cut to around $9 billion a year, we must strive to get the very, very best value for our money, and not just for the sake of the exchequer, but for the massive good British aid can still do in the world if it is not squandered. For example, approximately £4.3 billion is spent on asylum seekers arriving in the UK each year, a large proportion of the overall aid budget, leaving only £4.9 billion for actual aid work overseas. Now that budget has been further depleted to increase defence expenditure, it's vital that we bring down these costs associated with asylum seekers urgently, and this could be done in the following way. Asylum seekers arriving in the UK illegally on small boats or by other highly dangerous means need protection, they need support, they need compassion, they are people. However, what they don't need is to be put in hotels with no plans for the future. As anyone who's been cooped up in a hotel for more than a few weeks will know, this will cause their mental health to suffer and their drive and determination to wane. These asylum seekers come here full of hope for a better future, for themselves, for their families. They want to work, and we should give them the chance and support to do so, instead of leaving them in administrative limbo in hotels around the country, costing the taxpayer billions. If they have the chance to work their way into society, instead of remaining a burden on the exchequer and a burden to themselves, it would free up a large part of the remaining aid budget that could be spent on improving lives in the developing world, so that people do not need to risk their lives to come here in the first place. Indeed, people come here risking their all, and this does not cease once they enter our borders. In order to protect them from the clutches of human trafficking, I better sit down. Thank you.
Brian Lishman.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thanks to my honourable friend from Rotherham for bringing this debate this afternoon. The enormity of the challenges facing the world right now can seem somewhat overwhelming. We are all currently at varying speeds suffering from existential threat of climate change. We live in a global economy that is stacked in the favour of the few to the detriment of the many, and these issues are driving forces for the volatile, unstable world that we live in today. So, our government's attitude to the international community and how we tackle our own domestic issue of increasing inequality should be shaped by the principles of human rights, compassion and social justice, the very principles our party and our wider movement were founded on. So to cut overseas aid is a moral failing. Foreign aid should not be considered as an expense to be cut, for it is an investment in global stability, security and a commitment in making the world a better place. And like all cuts, whether domestic or foreign, it will be the poorest, the most disadvantaged and the most vulnerable people that will be hardest hit. Madam Deputy Speaker, we have the International Women's Day debate tomorrow, and women and girls in conflict-ridden areas like Sudan, Yemen, DR Congo, Syria and Gaza absolutely need our help. And cutting aid in these regions is not just short-sighted. It will abandon and consign millions to persecution, famine, illness and death. The government claims that this cut is necessary to fund an increase in defence spending, but framing things in that way is frankly wrong. Because cutting international development, as many honourable members have mentioned today, does not strengthen our security. Actually, it weakens it. Aid is a strategic investment in our long-term national interest. We've seen that the United States has slashed its foreign aid budget. AIDS and HIV clinics in places like Ukraine, Uganda, Liberia and South Africa are running out of medicine. In Sudan, 80% of emergency food kitchens have been shut down. People will starve because of this American decision. Let's not us make that same mistake. Madam Deputy Speaker, international leadership is desperately needed, arguably now more than ever. And the UK cutting overseas aid damages our credibility and diminishes our role on the world stage. Let us lead by example, not retreat into isolation. Let us reaffirm our commitment to being a force for good, a nation that stands up for its values, its security and, frankly, our global responsibilities. I implore the Minister and wider leadership to restore the UK's overseas development aid budget.
Alex Ballinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 20 years ago, I joined the Royal Marines, and roughly a year later, I was deployed to Afghanistan. I remember the challenges we faced, daily attacks from rockets and mortars, the daily struggle of IEDs, and massive underfunding and disappointments for the MOD's procurement system. Yeah. So many of us had to buy our own body armour. We ran out of desert boots and walked around in black boots in 40 degrees heat. Shocking. And we were driving Wimmick Land Rovers, which had no protection against the landmines that were in the area. So I understand that defence underfunding is not a new situation. But since 2010, when the UK last spent 2.5% of GDP on defence, there has been a decade of austerity under the Conservative government that has completely hollowed out the capability of our armed forces. With us now in the third year of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it has never been more important for our military to rebuild their capability, to show strength and support for our allies in Europe. So I completely back our Prime Minister and his decision to increase defence spending back to 2.5% of GDP and his ambition to go further in the next Parliament. This is the right course of action. The most effective way to ensure peace in Europe is through strength. But state-on-state conflict is not the only conflict that threatens us here in the UK. There are now more active conflicts across the globe than at any time since the end of the Second World War. In Gaza, Sudan, Yemen, Myanmar, the Sahel. And we need a strong military to protect our citizens and deter our enemies. But hand in hand with defence is our vital spending on international development. When I was in Afghanistan, serving alongside British soldiers and Marines were humanitarian workers, doctors and engineers. Our armed forces were working side by side with aid workers, just as British-backed aid workers are now in Ukraine working side by side with the brave Ukrainian armed forces. There are so many stories of the bravery of aid workers across the world's conflict zones, where fighting is causing destruction, starvation and violence against women.
Would my honourable friend give way?
I would have.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and thank you for bringing context like Afghanistan into this discussion, deeply fragile, unstable context. Does my honourable friend agree that in contexts like this, aid plays a deeply stabilising role, and as such contributes to global stability and security and to our own national security? And does he agree with me that that should be recognised in the tough choices we have about development spending?
Absolutely, and I think many of us that have served will recognise that development and defence are completely complementary, and when we reduce our development spending, our defence spending needs to go up. After I left the Royal Marines, colleagues and I worked with civil society in Syria, helping keep hopes of a different, more tolerant country alive during that civil war. Those groups now are probably the best hope for Syria's civil society and a more tolerant and stable country. Aid helps mitigate the worst impacts of conflict, and it also helps prevent further conflict. I'm concerned that cutting our development budget so deeply will undermine our ability to help stabilise fragile states, to reduce the drivers of extremism and prevent further conflicts emerging. And these implications will be felt here in the UK, with a greater chance of spikes in food and energy prices, increased migration and threats from extremist groups. And it will be our military and security services who face these challenges at a time when their attention should be on Ukraine. Whilst I wholly support raising our defence spending, I encourage the government over the next 2 years to look at opportunities to avoid such drastic cuts to our aid budget, particularly our investments in conflict zones and on preventing conflicts. Each pound we spend on conflict prevention can save £16 in aid to mitigate the destruction of conflict. I welcome the Prime Minister's pledge for an international fund for Israeli-Palestinian peace that he made in December last year, and I hope this remains a priority for the FCDO after the latest announcement. I strongly support the increase in defence spending announced last week, but I also urge, as a former Marine, that the government values the critical role our aid budget plays in delivering vital aid in conflict zones and preventing conflicts altogether.
Due to time constraints, I now need to come to the front benches. The Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Monica Harding.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, this month marks 10 years since the International Development Act, which committed this country to spending 0.7% of our national income on international development. This was a proud moment and represented the culmination of almost half a century of effort and advocacy by my party, the Liberal Democrats. But it was a political consensus across the House that created that legislation, one built on the work of the reforming Labour government of 1997, who committed to make poverty history, and was continued by a coalition of Conservatives and Liberal Democrats. Britain is a leader in international development for our expertise as well as our generosity, and consequently grew our influence on the world stage. Development opened opportunities for trade and growth and worked alongside defence and diplomacy as a third element of our foreign policy to keep us secure at home. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister's cuts of international development budget last week to 0.3% of GNI puts an end to that shared consensus. Let me be clear, Liberal Democrats support the increase in defence spending. We called for the uplift to 2.5% of GDP even before the Prime Minister committed to it, but we have laid out alternative funding plans. The world is changing fast, not least in the last 6 weeks. We must adapt. But this diminishing of our development spend will make us less secure, not more. International development serves our national and border security interests. It is our investment in a more stable world, and it pays dividends. By contrast, when we retreat, actors whose values and interests are not ours seize the opportunity, even as we watch President Trump and Elon Musk gut USAID, which was responsible for a fifth of global development spending. China is now moving to fill the gap, deepening its partnerships in the Indo-Pacific and Africa, where in 2024 alone, Beijing agreed more than $50 billion in loan and aid. When budget cuts forced the closure of BBC World Service Arabic radio in Lebanon, as we have heard, Radio Sputnik, Russian-backed radio, moved in. Development spending serves our health here in the UK and is put at risk by the Prime Minister's cut. Through our support for multilateral organisations like Gavi and the Global Fund, We have not only saved millions of lives, we have prevented diseases like Ebola from reaching pandemic proportions and causing devastation on British shores. And as Annalise Dodd's resignation letter makes clear, last week's decision will make it impossible to maintain all of the UK's development commitments. It may mean cutting strategic programmes that make vital contributions to UK security, including peace building and deconfliction work in fragile states. This will only produce more violence, more failed nations, more refugees, and in the breeding grounds of instability and extremism, risk the emergence of new terrorist groups that could threaten us here at home. The development cut will mean scaling back the climate finance that develops resilience and mitigation measures for countries on the front lines of climate change and reducing anti-poverty programmes for those very same nations. We know that for every 1% increase in food insecurity, there is a 2% increase in migration. Climate change and poverty, interacting with high birth rates and the extremely young populations in much of the global south, are a recipe for vast displacement of people. We know that in the next 10 years, 1.1 billion young people across the global south will become working-age adults, yet in those same countries we only expect 325 million jobs to be created. Supporting these economies is in our interests. More conflict will only exacerbate the situation. Last year, even as the world's largest humanitarian catastrophe unfolds, more than 2,000 people from Sudan crossed the Channel on small boats. Mr. Speaker, levels of refugees and migration are already at their highest level since the end of the Second World War. Excuse me, Madam Deputy Speaker, and the Prime Minister's decision risks further displacement. So can I ask the Minister to clarify, why was no impact assessment done in advance of these cuts? When will it be done, and when will this House see it? Madam Deputy Speaker, in 2023, the UK spent 0.2% of GNI on official development assistance within the UK, most of which, over £4 billion, in fact, was used to host in-country refugees. If anything like this continues, we will be left with just 0.1% of GNI to finance our overseas aid objectives. Among the 32 countries that comprise the OECD's Development Assistance Committee, our aid spend would then be the smallest of anyone's, save for Viktor Orban's Hungary, lower than all of the G7. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a long way to fall from being a global leader in development spending and the second biggest donor out of the G7. So will the government reconsider its decision to count in-country refugee costs as ODA, so that what little will remain after this cut can actually be used to advance UK interests abroad? Will the Minister confirm, in view of the government's statements in the other place yesterday, that money for the Integrated Security Fund will be ring-fenced? And to safeguard British soft power, can he also confirm that the current level of ODA allocated to both the BBC World Service and the British Council will be protected? Will the Minister clarify how much of the total 0.3% has already been assigned to multilateral commitments? Is the money still ring-fenced? And if so, how much will be left available for bilateral assistance? How will this cut affect UK-run programmes in Sudan, in Gaza and the West Bank, in Jordan, where UK ODA is used to support displaced people and prevent further waves of refugees, in the DRC and in Myanmar? And most importantly, is 0.3% the floor or the ceiling? Madam Deputy Speaker, in the past, Britain's overseas aid spending, which includes reaching 13.8 million people with food aid, helping 95 million people to cope with the effects of climate change, and inoculating 15 million children with life-saving vaccines, has reflected the deep generosity of the British people. We see this again and again in just how much is donated to appeals in response to natural disaster across the world, but we should never mistake development for charity. We reap the benefits of a safer, richer world through increased trade and growth, and critically through our security, national health and border security. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd hoped that this government would reset the UK's place on the world stage as it promised. I had hoped that it would return us to the 0.7% target as promised in its manifesto. In the past, that front bench, including the Prime Minister, spoke with vigour about the importance of development for security and the short-sightedness of previous Conservative cuts. Now, in dereliction of their values, Labour has gone further than the Conservatives ever did. This world is becoming ever more dangerous. The norms of the international order have been turned on their head. Only yesterday in the UN, the United States denounced the Sustainable Development Goals, developed collaboratively in pursuit of a better world. Liberal Democrats had hoped that the UK would step up and lead on development, recognising its vital importance to our own future security. Instead, the government has cut development to its lowest level this century. This is a short-sighted, strategically unwise decision, and it will leave us less safe. It is not only the millions of the world's poorest that will feel this, but it is our constituents too. Thank you.
And before I just call the Shadow Secretary, members should be referenced by their constituencies or their titles if the minister's not by their first name. I call the Shadow Secretary of State, Dame Priti Patel.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to begin my remarks by paying tribute, actually, to the many speakers that we've had here today, but in particular to the Chair of the IDC. The Honourable Member for Rotherham has been a long-standing advocate for development aid, and I've had the greatest privilege of working with her as well. And, you know, I understand thoroughly her commitment. And I would just like to pay tribute to a few other colleagues as well. In particular, my right honourable friend, the member for Sutton Coldfield, who has been a long-standing, dedicated and passionate advocate for 0.7%, but also the effective use of it, if I may say so. And alongside that, working with the private sector, which he and I have both had the enormous privilege of doing so. And I would just like to pay tribute, if I may, to the Right Honourable Member for Oxford East for her commitment. I've had the privilege of working with her as well, and I must say that during her time in government, she was very professional and committed to her brief. And of course, it was last week, Madam Deputy Speaker, where the government sent her here to defend the indefensible Labour-Chagos surrender deal using money transferred from the aid budget to defence, which is then again going to be paid to pay the lease of a site that we hold sovereignty over. I won't give way because I do not have time. Madam Deputy Speaker, now to spare the blushes of the Minister, I'm not going to relitigate the debate, and I'm glad he's here in his place today because there's a lot to cover. And he himself will speak passionately about development aid and assistance because of his own background and experience. But I would like to ask him a particular question in relation to the British Indian Overseas Territory, and effectively about where the least costs will be coming from in the budgets, whether it's FCO, Defence, ODA budget. I think we still need to have some explanation over that. And I would just like to say to the Minister, I do want to thank him because before this debate started, I did receive a flurry of answers to some of the questions that I've been posing on this issue, but I still do not have clarification, just for the record, so there'll be more. But Madam Deputy Speaker, I do want to speak about defence spending and ODA. The government was right to follow our calls in terms of redirecting some ODA funds to support the defence budget at this critical time. We've heard, I'm not going to give way because I simply don't have time. If the Honourable Member will just respect that, we are on very short time today. The threats we and our allies face necessitated this particular decision, and there is consensus from the respective front benches on this. And it importantly shows our enemies and our adversaries that we as a country are serious when it comes to the malign influences and the challenges that we face. The Minister knows the implications for this, but obviously we must always look to increase our defence spending and resources. We'll work collectively together on all of that. We all recognise, and I think this debate has shown this as well, that many of the decisions over ODA have been difficult to make and the choices that have been made. There are strong views in this House, and if I may say so, members on these benches as well, the member for Chester South and Eddisbury pointed to some of the choices that have been made, but the Right Honourable Member, the member for Maldon, also spoke that we must still champion media freedoms and some of the real pressures that we will be standing up for and some of the key values. As a former Secretary of State for Development myself, I know the benefits. I absolutely have been there and I understand the impact of UK aid, how we stand strong in the world, the use of soft power, the way in which we save lives, whether it's Global Fund, Garvey. We know the funds very, very well. We have been huge supporters, and Britain has saved lives and changed lives around the world. We are all proud of that. There is no question about that. But I would like to ask the Minister in particular, and I think these points have been made already, Where will the government take the lead, on which development programmes in particular? We know about Sudan, that has been referenced by the Prime Minister, but there are so many other areas of conflict in the world, including Yemen. I've not heard Yemen mentioned in this House for too long, I'm afraid to say. But also when it comes to Gavi, where will we be on the Replenishment Global Fund? I know ministers will say they'll wait to the spending review, but given ODA spending will still be pegged to a proportion of GNI, and when the minister responds, can he give a commitment in terms of the potential for published plans? Also, we'd like to know more about the split of ODA between government departments. Home Office spending on ODA and asylum has already been raised several times, but I know that the Minister will want to speak about that as well. We'd like to know more about the Integrated Security Fund and where decisions and choices will be made on that in particular and what clarity can be given. And also, again, when it comes to CCF, which was mentioned, but perhaps even the role of British international investment and perhaps some of the opportunities there. I would, Madam Deputy Speaker, just like to touch on Ukraine briefly in the time that I have, and there are some other areas too. It is quite clear we stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. Their fight is our fight. They're on the front line protecting the very principles that underpin our way of life: sovereignty, democracy, the rule of law. Will the Minister be able to say, particularly now with the changes in defence spending that will be forthcoming, will the government turbocharge in a positive way the ability to now progress the work of the summit that the Prime Minister led at the weekend? But importantly, as we know, the Americans have already spoken about pausing military aid and intelligence sharing. What work will we do now to make sure that actually that doesn't happen in the headline ways in which we've heard, but how are we going to respond to that? Are we having constructive dialogue with our friends in the US administration to safeguard key intelligence and security assets? This is a defining moment. I do just want to touch on the Middle East as well, and in particular when it comes to some of the discussions we had in the UQ yesterday, but where we are in terms of the ceasefire, ensuring that we are always standing strong when it comes to standing up for the hostages. But there are new discussions that took place in Cairo, and also when these plans are forthcoming, what role will we be playing as a country, specifically in some of those areas too? I do have to, Madam Deputy Speaker, just raise the whole issue of Iran. Our diplomatic and security efforts obviously have to ensure that we are addressing this malign influence. I welcome the government actions that were undertaken yesterday on the enhanced tier of furs, but I do want to press ministers to go further, that we have a consistent and serious approach across government. This is a whole of government effort now when it comes to security and defence. Also, when it comes to China, I have to say we've heard in this House day after day, we know the threats posed by Russia, Iran, but also China. They continue to cast a dark shadow over freedom, democracy and our national interests. We have to stop going cap in hand, Madam Deputy Speaker, to China. We've got to do much more, and I hope the Minister can just reflect upon what I consider to be the government's reckless approach in kowtowing to China. But what are we going to do to ensure that the vacuum that will now be posed in some parts of the world will not be filled by China, but how are we going to stand up to them in particular? Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's pretty clear that we live in an increasing dangerous and uncertain world. The threats are increasing and growing. The Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office has one of the greatest privileges in the world, which is standing up to look after our security, defence, our freedom, using soft power and all the levers that it has. We urge ministers, within the scope that they have now, to tackle the real threats and challenges that we all face globally, but also to give voice and representation to many of the issues that colleagues have spoken about today in this House.
Minister Stephen Doughty.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I start by thanking all the honourable and right honourable members for passionate and sincere contributions to today's debate, and I know we have an incredible wealth of experience, not least in terms of former ministers, former members of the committee, current members of the committee. I was a former member of the committee, Deputy Speaker, and also many who have worked in the international development sector, but also on wider foreign affairs and security issues, and of course, notably those who've served in our armed forces. forces, and we thank them for that service and all of those who've served our country in humanitarian security and defence roles. And I particularly want to thank my honourable friend, the chair of the committee, the member for Rotherham, for opening this debate, and she makes her point strongly and forcibly. She's done an important role as chair of that committee, and we take very sincerely the points that she's making and hear them all, and I will make sure that they are communicated to the new Minister of State, Minister in the other place. These are indeed challenging times, Madam Deputy Speaker, and they're challenging times which demand tough choices and clear leadership. And if I may as well, Madam Deputy Speaker, add my own tribute to the work of my former colleague, my current colleague still in the House, the Right Honourable Member for Oxford East. I've known her for nearly 30 years. She's a person of absolute integrity and sincerity, and I'm sure she will contribute continually in this House on many matters of importance. But I thank her for her work. And I also want to thank all of the staff at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and indeed our arm's length bodies, and indeed other organisations like the BBC World Service and the British Council, for the incredible work they do. Former ministers opposite will know the absolutely incredible work that our teams of staff have done, both with the previous government and for this government on these matters. And it is absolutely right, at times of uncertainty like this, that we recognise their contribution and their work. And I thank all the honourable members who've raised that point in particular. I want to be as transparent and as open as I can, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have noted all of the very many different points, whether it's about specific geographic locations and specific programmes. I'm going to be completely honest, I am not in a position today to answer some of the specific questions that have been raised about specific funding for specific programmes, but I will ensure that those points are heard loud and clear by my right honourable friend, the Minister of State for Development, and I take them with sincerity. It's been very helpful debate in that respect to understand the priorities of this House and this place. I'll happily give way.
Emily Darlington.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I know the the honourable members' absolute passion and experience in this area, particularly on international development, that he had under the last Labour government. As chair of the APPG on Aid Match, does he see a role for the generosity of the UK public in ensuring that they can match and supplement our efforts in rebuilding countries, but also in furthering our aims right across the world?
Absolutely, and I pay tribute to her experience on these issues and work on them over many years. She's right, absolutely, aid match is crucially important, and indeed we very much hope to continue the work. The issue, of what the British government, the British public do on this is remarkable when we come to their generosity, when it comes to whether it's Gaza, whether it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to many crises around the world. And I pay tribute to all the communities up and down this country and individuals who do such brilliant generosity and fundraising.
So Julian Lewis.
I'm very grateful to the Minister. Would it be fair to say that the step that has been taken to use development money for the immediate or relatively prompt increase in defence is essentially a short-term measure which will have to be substituted by other long-term measures, given that the increase in defence, if it's to fund a security contribution to a divided Ukraine, will be an indefinite commitment?
Minister.
Well, I obviously can't speak many years into the future, but he's absolutely right. Our intent is to get back to 0.7% of GNI as soon as the fiscal circumstances allow, and the Prime Minister has been very, very clear about that. I want to also acknowledge, I'm not going to take any more interventions, I'm afraid, because of the time I need to respond to the points that have been made. But I think it was clear across the House today that we all agree, with a couple of exceptions, that our defence spending needs to go up. There is absolutely clear unity on Ukraine. We'll obviously be setting out the further work on from the summit at the weekend and how we go forward. There's been very important conversations on that over recent days that myself, the Foreign Secretary, the Prime Minister and others have been involved in. But it is clear that at this time of profound change, with conflicts overseas undermining security and prosperity at home, the Prime Minister took that decision to increase spending on defence, rightly, to 2.5% of GDP from 2027, and that will be funded by cutting our spending on overseas development from 0.5% to 0.3%. The Prime Minister was absolutely clear this was not an announcement he was happy to make. And I know there are a couple of members who suggested opposite. The Prime Minister is a man of integrity and sincerity on this issue, and I urge colleagues to look very carefully at what he said about this. And this is, for me as well, a very sincere but difficult decision, not least my own experience working in humanitarian and international development NGOs, and indeed at the former Department for International Development. I too have seen, as many members have reflected on, the very positive impacts that Britain's proud record on overseas development have had on lives around the world. And as the Prime Minister said, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will continue to play a key role, doing everything we can to move towards rebuilding our capacity and remain committed to working in Sudan, in Ukraine, in Gaza, on tackling climate change, on supporting multinational efforts on global health and challenges like vaccination, of course, our commitments to the overseas territories too. And I have to really level with the House, and I hope people can see and feel this, but in this dangerous new era, the defence and national security of this country must come first. This is not the 1990s, this is not even 2005, and I cannot look at what I do every day, or indeed other ministers look at every day, and not recognise that we have to respond differently to the very, very serious threats facing this country, our continent and the world. And I say that in deep candour. So this difficult choice reflects the evolving nature of the threats we face and the strategic shifts required to meet them while maintaining economic stability, the foundation of this government's plan for change. We will also ensure that every pound of development assistance is spent in the most impactful way, equipping the FCDO to deliver the plan for change internationally. The changes in this estimate reflect that approach, and we will continue as the FCDO overall, not just on ODA, to focus on growth, security, Europe, migration, climate and nature and development. And reducing the overall size of our ODA budget will necessarily have an impact on the scale and shape of the work we do. We will consider how to maximise the value of our budget throughout the ongoing spending review. But ODA, of course, alone is not and has never been the single answer to the many challenges of international development. We have to use all the levers at our disposal to support development aims and make use of all forms of development finance to maximise the impact of our ODA. We've set out, obviously, the detail of the changes that have been made. Many members have raised concerns about the asylum spending. The Home Office introduced policy and operational changes within the asylum system to reduce the impact on UK ODA spend, and the Home Secretary is committed to ensuring that asylum costs fall. And indeed, this has already had an impact, and the government has taken measures to reduce the asylum backlog and the use of expensive asylum accommodation in the next spending review period, and increased detention capacity to facilitate more removals. The Chief Secretary of the Treasury considered the impact of the rise in GNI and reduction in asylum costs, among other changes to ODA forecasts in the round, and agreed that the FCDO would receive an uplift to our 2024-25 ODA settlement in the region of 540 million. Many of my right honourable colleagues have raised questions on 2025-26. We will be setting initial budgets for 25-26 to minimise disruption to key programmes as we transition financial years. The details of that will be set out in due course. The ODA budgets for future years are currently under review by the government. We'll confirm details to this House in due course, and I want to be honest, we cannot at this stage provide categorical assurances, but I assure that the points have been heard clearly. Many members raised debt relief. Supporting developing countries to tackle unsustainable debt is a key development priority of this government, and we need to take that twin track approach of tackling immediate challenges and the underlying drivers of sustainable debt. BII was mentioned, absolutely a crucial part of our development architecture. We've provided additional support to BII. We're going to be working very closely with them on their role. And indeed, in 2023, BII-backed businesses provided jobs for more than 1 million people, paid $2.5 billion in taxes, and generated huge amounts of electricity, and need a clearer role for that. Important points about the British Council, the funding that we are giving there, taken those on board for the World Service, again, an organisation we hugely support, of course. Our part of the funding for that has gone up by 32.6 million for fiscal year 25-26. The role of SDRs has been pointed to. Women and girls, I want to absolutely highlight, we will continue to centre women and girls in everything we do internationally, and impact assessments raised many times. Of course, impact assessments, including on the impact on women and girls, will be a crucial part going forward. I mentioned Aid Match, and I mentioned many of the other things, but what I will say, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that these are incredibly difficult choices, but they are the right choices in the circumstances that we find ourselves in. They are not ones we make lightly. I have heard sincerely all of the contributions made today, and we will come back to the House in due course with further information. I commend these estimates to the House.
Sarah Champion to wind up.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I thank everybody that spoke today and also express my deep regret for those that were unable to speak. But there are many avenues within this House where you can make your voices heard. And I want to end by saying if we leave the international stage, I am very, very concerned about those who might step in who will have less generous intent.
Order, order. The question necessary to dispose of the motion stands over until 7 p.m. under Standing Order number 54. Point of order, Emily Thornberry.
It's a point of clarification, really. When I made my contribution, I referred to Jordan, and I should have referred the House to my Register of Interests. I recently went to Jordan at the invitation of the King, and I should have said so.
Can I thank the Right Honourable Member for putting that point of clarification on the record?